Welcome, dear reader, to a fascinating journey through the medieval world, a time when life was full of challenges, yet equally rich with innovation, creativity, and a profound connection to food. In the absence of today's fast food chains and convenience stores, the people of the Middle Ages had to rely on what they could grow, hunt, or gather. But even amidst the hardships of life, food was not just a necessity for survival. It was a reflection of culture, social status, and ingenuity. Imagine, if you will, stepping into a world of stone castles, dense forests, and bustling marketplaces. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meats, freshly baked bread, and the faint aroma of herbs and spices carried on the wind. It's here, in this vibrant world, that food plays a role far beyond mere sustenance. The food they ate told stories of class culture and survival in a time when luxuries were few and every meal was a chance to celebrate or endure. In the medieval world, food was often more than just nourishment. It was a way of bringing people together, a means of marking important events, or even an escape from the daily grind. And just like today, people had their indulgences, snacks, treats, and comfort foods that offered a brief respite from their otherwise tough lives. But what did medieval snacks look like? What did the common folk nibble on between long hours of hard work? And how did the noble classes enjoy their delicacies during elaborate feasts? These foods, while not as glamorous as the elaborate banquets we imagine today, were integral to the fabric of medieval society. They tell the story of a people who, despite having fewer resources and conveniences than we enjoy, found ways to create flavors, textures, and dishes that could not only satisfy hunger, but also provide moments of joy and connection. As we dive into the world of medieval snacks, we'll uncover foods that were both simple and inventive. The apple fritters that mimic the shape and texture of what we might call a donut today, or the cheese curds, which, despite their modest origins, were a satisfying snack enjoyed by travelers and peasants alike. We'll also explore the humble turnip pie, a poor man's dessert that, though often bland, could be made to carry a surprising sweetness when prepared with honey or dried fruits. The foods of medieval times weren't just about sustenance. They were about survival, creativity, and making the most of what was available. They found clever ways to take simple ingredients like flour, vegetables, and scraps of meat, and turn them into dishes that were both filling and delicious. And what's truly remarkable is that many of these foods are still around in some form today. Whether it's the portable and hearty meat pasty, what we might call the medieval hot pocket, or the sweet honey cake, these foods have stood the test of time, evolving through the centuries into the snacks we enjoy today. But let's take a moment to consider the world these foods existed in. Picture yourself in a bustling medieval marketplace. The air is filled with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, fresh bread, hot meat pies, sweet pastries. The sun shines down on wooden stalls, and the streets are alive with the chatter of people, their lives interwoven with the food they consume. This was a time when food could tell you a lot about a person's status, their wealth, and their place in society. The rich enjoyed feasts of roasted meats, imported spices, and rare fruits, while the poor made do with whatever they could grow or trade. It was also a time when meals were often communal and food was a social affair. In the evenings, families gathered around hearths to share whatever they had. Sometimes a hearty stew, sometimes a simple loaf of bread. Meals, though far from the lavish spreads we might imagine today, had a sense of comfort and warmth. They were a time to unwind, to catch up on the day's events, and to ensure that the bonds of community and family were strengthened over shared food. But it wasn't just about sustenance and survival. For the medieval man or woman, food was a way of indulging in the little pleasures of life. The apple fritters, crispy on the outside, soft and sweet on the inside, were the equivalent of today's donut, an occasional indulgence that was both comforting and satisfying. Similarly, the cheese curds, though simple and unpretentious, offered a delightful texture that could be eaten on the go during travel or at markets. Then, of course, there were the dishes that took a little more creativity to prepare, like the turnip pie, a dessert born out of necessity but elevated with honey and dried fruits when available. Or the meat pasty, which was designed for workers and travelers who needed a portable filling meal that could be eaten on the move. These foods, while far from fancy, were the heart and soul of medieval snacking culture. As we step through the corridors of history, we'll find that these foods weren't just about what was eaten, but also about how they were eaten. The way they were prepared, served, and consumed spoke volumes about the people who enjoyed them. Take the blood pudding balls, for example, a hearty and savory treat that was rich in iron, perfect for the working class or for those who had to face the cold winters. Or the candied fennel seeds, which served a dual purpose, not only as a sweet treat, but as a digestive aid, refreshing the breath after a heavy meal. Even the simple concept of bread soaked in ale reveals something about medieval life. This dish, often consumed by the working class after a long day, was a practical comfort food that offered sustenance and relaxation. It was something that transcended the mere act of eating. It became a ritual of unwinding, a moment of solace after a hard day's labor. As we explore these delightful medieval snacks, it's important to remember that while they may seem rudimentary compared to today's offerings, they were an essential part of daily life. They provided not only nourishment, but also a sense of continuity and tradition. The act of preparing and sharing these foods became a way to preserve culture, connect with others, and even escape from the harsh realities of life. And as you read through the stories of these medieval treats, you might find yourself reflecting on your own favorite snacks. Perhaps you'll be reminded of simpler times in your own life when food in all its forms brought comfort and connection. Just as medieval people found joy in their snacks, we too can find moments of delight in the foods we eat today. If you're enjoying this glimpse into the culinary past and want to learn more about how these snacks evolved or their deeper cultural significance, be sure to like, share, and comment below. Let us know your favorite medieval treat or any questions you may have about the fascinating world of medieval food. In a small, bustling medieval village, the morning sun had begun to rise, casting a golden glow over the cobblestone streets. The marketplace, already alive with the sounds of merchants calling out their wares, was a familiar sight to all who lived nearby. Among the rows of stalls, a certain vendor stood out. His booth, with its iron cauldron bubbling over an open flame, sent the rich scent of sizzling food into the air. It was here that the humble apple fritters were born, a snack enjoyed by peasants and nobles alike, though for very different reasons. The preparation was simple, yet rewarding. Apples, fresh from the orchard, or perhaps saved from last season's harvest, were peeled and chopped with care. They were mixed with flour, eggs, and a splash of ale, a touch of levity to lift the batter's spirits. The secret ingredient, however, lay in the pig fat. Rendered and used in abundance, it gave the fritters a richness that could not be matched. For the wealthier folk, honey, or perhaps a pinch of imported sugar, was added to the batter, lending a sweetness that was as rare as it was treasured. But for most, the simple fat-fried dough was sweet enough on its own. The cooking process was far from delicate. In an iron pot, the oil, perhaps reused from the previous day's fry, heated to a golden shimmer. The batter was spooned in, and within moments, the air was filled with the sizzle and pop of the hot oil. The fritters browned quickly, their edges crisping to a delightful crunch, while the insides remained soft, almost pillowy. A delicate golden hue settled over each one as they were fished out of the pot, still glistening with the excess oil. This was a food meant for the market, meant for the hands of the weary traveler and the busy farmer alike. The fritters were easy to hold, a perfect snack for those who wandered between stalls, taking their rest only when they could afford it. The stall itself was a quiet gathering place where the townsfolk paused to take in the treat that promised both warmth and satisfaction. They were best served hot fresh from the frying pan. The crispy exterior, with its slight sheen of oil, offered a satisfying contrast to the softness within. The first bite was always the most glorious, as the warmth of the fritter met the coolness of the morning air. A rush of sweetness filled the mouth, sometimes with a hint of ale, but always with the comfort of a meal prepared with care. For the common folk, these fritters were a rare indulgence, an affordable delight that brought a brief moment of pleasure to an otherwise hard day. Yet for those whose wealth allowed for it, apple fritters took on a different meaning. They became a special treat to be shared with guests at fairs and festivals, perhaps dusted with honey or sprinkled with sugar, the fine grains melting into the warm dough. When served at such events, they were not just a food. They were a symbol of affluence and edible luxury that marked the occasion. In these moments, the fritters became more than sustenance. They were a social act, a way for the noble to display both their wealth and their hospitality. But whether simple or sweetened, the apple fritter held a special place in the hearts of all who partook in its warmth. It was a reminder of the simplicity and comfort that food could bring, even in the harshest of times. In the cool autumn mornings or on the warm summer evenings, it was there, crisp, golden, and perfectly satisfying. And as the marketplace grew busier, the stall vendor's call would echo, drawing in the crowds ready for their moment of indulgence. It was, in truth, a rare treat, a fleeting taste of sweetness in a world that was often bitter. Yet this simple snack managed to bring together all levels of society, for no one could resist the allure of a warm, crispy fritter. And so, in the quiet spaces of a busy market, it was there ready to offer a moment's respite, a small, humble pleasure amidst the hard work of the day. In the heart of the medieval countryside, beneath the shade of large oak trees, a small cottage stood nestled at the edge of the village. The air here was always rich with the scent of fresh milk and warm cheese, for this was the home of a humble dairywoman who crafted one of the simplest yet most cherished treats of the medieval world, the cheese curd. Cheese curds, unlike their aged counterparts, were a fresh, unripened form of cheese, bright white and delicate, with a texture that could only be described as squeaky. These tiny bits of cheese were made from milk that had been carefully curdled and separated, a process known to many a dairymaid. Once the milk had curdled, the curds were gently pressed, releasing excess whey, and then lightly salted. This was the base of the curd, simple, yet filled with a richness that came from the land itself. Unlike the complex cheeses of the wealthy, which were aged and carefully guarded, curds were immediate. There was no waiting, just a fresh bite of dairy, perfect for those with the time or need for a quick snack. They were light and airy, their flavor mild but undeniably satisfying. Their squeak, as they were bitten into that soft yet firm texture, was a sound that spoke to the simplicity and pleasure of the treat. The very nature of cheese curds, so fleeting, so fresh, made them a delight to eat. In medieval life, cheese curds were a food of the common folk, a snack for those who walked the long roads between towns or worked in the fields under the hot summer sun. They were easy to carry, compact and light in their pouch, offering a quick pick-me-up when hunger struck. Whether traveling from one village to the next or resting after hours of labor, the curd was the perfect humble snack. It required no preparation, no elaborate cooking, just a pinch of salt and a handful of fresh curds, and the task was complete. In the towns, at the markets, the curds could be found alongside loaves of bread and baskets of vegetables, simple yet comforting in their quiet presence. They weren't the kind of treat that drew large crowds, nor were they ever the subject of grand feasts. But for the laborers, the shepherds, and the farmers, the cheese curd was a welcome indulgence, something to nibble on as they worked, or a small pleasure to share among friends. It was said that the curd was most enjoyable when freshly made, still warm from the vat, and perhaps even more so when shared. Travelers and villagers alike would often find themselves exchanging a handful of curds in the evening, accompanied by a simple piece of bread or a sip of ale. There was something inherently satisfying in the pairing of the curd with the rustic bread, each bite a reminder of the earth, the animals, and the labor that went into producing them. For some, the curds were a snack eaten at the end of the day when the sun was low and the light dimmed over the fields. After a hard day's work, the cheese curds were consumed, slowly savored for their soft texture and mild saltiness. This was a time of reflection, when there was nothing more to be done but to sit and enjoy the fruits of one's labor. And in those quiet moments, the squeaky curds were enough to provide a sense of comfort, a reminder of the simple joys of life. Though humble in their origins, cheese curds carried with them a sense of satisfaction that could not be overlooked. They were not grand like the feast dishes of the noble court, nor were they luxurious like the imported fruits or honey served at royal tables. But in their own way, cheese curds were the very essence of what it meant to live in the medieval world. They were unpretentious and straightforward, a food that required no pretense or ceremony. They were simply good. In a world where food was often a matter of necessity, the curd served as a bridge between the mundane and the indulgent. They were not for the banquets or festivals where roasted meats and fine wines were enjoyed, but rather for the moments in between, when the work was done, the roads were long, and the sun began to set. They were the treat that gave the weary traveler the energy to keep walking, the humble snack that brightened the day. The texture of the curds, too, was part of their appeal. They were neither soft nor firm, but rather a pleasing middle ground, rubbery in their bounce and squeaky with each bite. This distinctive sound, once heard, was not easily forgotten. It was a sensory memory, one that linked the curd to the rhythm of medieval life. For those who had tasted them, that squeak became an echo of simpler times, a small joy that for just a moment could carry them away from the troubles of the day. Though it was not a luxury, food cheese curds did have their place in the social structure of medieval life. They were a treat of the people, a reminder of the bounty the land could offer, even in its most basic form. And like many foods of the time, they provided a way for people to gather and share. In the villages, they were often enjoyed alongside a hearty loaf of bread in the homes of farmers and workers who had little but shared everything. A handful of curds offered comfort, a connection to the land, and a taste of something both simple and satisfying. It was said that cheese curds were often eaten in the fields during harvest time, a quick snack before returning to the heavy labor of the day. They were eaten while sitting upon the cool earth, with the sound of distant cattle lowing in the background. There, in those quiet moments, the curds were a gift, a small treasure amidst the toil, a morsel of indulgence in a day filled with sweat and dust. Though the curd could never be a feast, it could always be a moment of contentment. It was enough. The cheese curd, like the apple fritter, was part of a long tradition of simple, sustaining food that carried with it a sense of heritage and place. Both food and ritual, the curd was a reminder of the ancient ways, how despite the passage of time and the changes in the world, there are still pleasures to be found in the simplest things. The curd would remain a beloved snack in the hearts of those who had tasted it, offering a sense of comfort and home wherever it was found. And as the sun began to set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields, the sound of the curds being chewed would linger in the air, quiet, content, and full of the earth. It was a simple treat, but in its own way, it was everything. In the humble kitchens of medieval peasants, there was little room for extravagance. The hearth, ever crackling with the warmth of a low flame, was often the only source of light and comfort in the otherwise cold and sparse room. It was here, amidst the bare stone walls and worn wooden tables, that turnip pie, a simple filling dessert, was often made. The turnip, though not a glamorous vegetable, had long been a staple of the common folk, its earthiness forming the foundation of many a dish. Yet in the hands of a skilled cook, even the lowly turnip could be transformed into something more than just sustenance. Turnip pie was not a dish born of indulgence, nor one crafted for kings or nobles. It was a humble creation, made from the most basic of ingredients. Mashed turnips boiled until soft and mashed into a smooth paste formed the heart of the pie. An egg was added, its richness blending with the turnips, giving the filling a slight firmness. Honey, a rare and precious sweetener in many parts of medieval Europe, would be stirred in, though only in small amounts, for it was a luxury. Sometimes dried fruit raisins or figs was added, giving a touch of sweetness that helped mask the turnip's natural bitterness. The preparation of the pie was simple, yet each step held significance. The turnips, having been harvested from the cold, damp soil, were the result of hard work, their roots dug deep into the earth. Boiling them to a tender state was no great feat, yet it was a labor of patience. Once mashed, they were mixed with the egg, which came from the hens kept in the small coops behind the cottages. The honey, perhaps acquired through trade or from the local beekeeper, added a hint of sweetness that balanced the dish's otherwise hearty and often bitter nature. The crust, often made of the same simple flour and water dough used for many a rustic bread, was rolled out with a steady hand. The thin layer of pastry was not delicate or flaky like the pies of nobler kitchens, but instead it was sturdy, a practical vessel for the filling that would be spooned into it. Once the pie was assembled, it was placed into the oven, where the heat of the flames would transform the humble ingredients into something more, something that in its simplicity carried with it the essence of medieval life. For those in the lower classes, a turnip pie was a rare treat often reserved for special occasions. The day's meal might consist of nothing but stale bread and water, but the turnip pie was a reminder that even the simplest of foods could offer a small moment of comfort. It was a filling dish, one that could sustain the family through a long, hard day of work. It was not a pie of extravagance or flavor, but of sustenance and warmth. The taste, too, was not one of sweetness or indulgence. For many, the turnip pie was bland, the natural bitterness of the root vegetable often dominating the flavor. It was a dish meant to fill the stomach, not to delight the palate. But for those who knew no other kind of pie, it was a dish that provided a sense of home and familiarity. The honey, when used, might bring a fleeting sweetness, but it was the earthiness of the turnip that lingered, the flavor that connected the dish to the soil, to the work of the hands that had tended the fields. Yet there were moments when the pie could be sweetened to a greater degree. In wealthier households, where honey was more plentiful and dried fruits were easier to come by, the turnip pie became a more palatable dessert. The added sweetness would transform the dish, turning it into something that could be served at feasts where it might be offered alongside more opulent dishes. In these instances, the turnip pie became a symbol of the transformation of simple ingredients into something more, a reflection of the time and effort put into the dish. It was, however, in the monasteries where the turnip pie found its most frequent home. Monks, with their self-sustaining gardens and vast knowledge of herbs, would often prepare such pies as a way of utilizing the harvest from their fields. They did not have the luxury of sugar or fine spices, but the honey and dried fruits from their own gardens could provide just enough sweetness to make the dish more enjoyable. These pies were served to the community both as a practical meal and as a symbol of the monastery's connection to the land. Turnip pie, while never a delicacy, had a quiet place in the culinary traditions of the time. It was a food of necessity, born from the land and shaped by the constraints of the world in which it was made. It was the pie of peasants and monks, the humble filling that could be made when little else was available. And yet it was more than just food. It was a reflection of the life that surrounded it. It was a symbol of endurance, of making do with what little one had, and of finding comfort in the most unassuming of dishes. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the fire burned low and the family gathered together, the turnip pie would be served. Its earthy aroma would fill the air, the smell of roasted vegetables mixed with the faint sweetness of honey. It was a dish that was not shared in the grand halls of nobility, but in the small cottages of the village where the warmth of the hearth was all that mattered. And as the pie was eaten slowly and steadily, the bonds of family were strengthened. For in a world of uncertainty, there was comfort in the simple things. And the turnip pie, bitter, hearty, and plain, was one of those small comforts that made life just for a moment a little sweeter. Though often forgotten by history, the turnip pie carried with it the essence of medieval life. It was a dish born of necessity, created in the kitchens of those who had little and yet made much of what they had. It was a reminder that even in the most difficult of times, there could be moments of comfort found in the simplest of foods. And in its quiet way, the turnip pie served as a testament to the resilience of the people who made it and the enduring connection they had to the land that sustained them. The morning fog hung low over the hills, clinging to the earth like a secret. Beneath its gray shroud, the village stirred to life. Men and women began their early work tending to fields, gathering firewood, or preparing the day's meal. It was in this quiet moment, amid the soft rustling of leaves and the distant sound of livestock, that the meat pasty came to life, an unassuming yet vital companion to the day's labor. In the cool shadows of the kitchen, a heavy stone oven began to heat, and the scent of bread dough filled the air. Simple yet sturdy, the dough was mixed from flour water and a pinch of salt, its texture thick and unyielding, perfect for holding what would come inside. The pasty was not meant to be delicate or refined. It was meant to be practical, a meal on the go for those who had neither the time nor the luxury to sit and dine in comfort. A worker tired from hours of toil in the fields could carry it in hand and eat it as they moved about their task, never ceasing. The filling, a hearty mixture of meat and vegetables, was the heart of the pasty. The choice of filling depended on what was available. For the common folk, pork or mutton were the usual fare. The meat was chopped coarsely and mixed with onions, herbs, and sometimes a handful of root vegetables, potatoes or turnips, things that could be grown with little care. These ingredients, once combined, were packed neatly into the dough, folded over, and sealed to create a sturdy pocket-like pouch. For those in the higher echelons of society, the filling could be more varied. Rabbit, pigeon, or even game birds might find their way into the pasty, their meats tender and flavorful. The use of spices, too, was more common in the kitchens of the rich. A dash of saffron, perhaps, or a sprinkle of cinnamon to elevate the flavor. But for the most part, the meat pasty was a humble creation meant to be filling rather than fancy. Once sealed, the pasty was placed carefully in the oven. The heat of the fire worked its magic, turning the dough golden and crisp. The meat inside would slowly cook, melding with the vegetables and herbs to create a savory filling. The pasty, when finished, was often darkened at the edges, its surface slightly charred, the scent of roasted meat rising from the crust. This, however, was not a perfect science. The pasty, like many foods of the time, was prone to imperfections. In the kitchens of the poor, where meat could be scarce or hard to come by, the filling might be made with less than ideal cuts. Sometimes, the meat was overcooked, tough and dry, or worse still, dubious in its freshness. But such was the nature of medieval life. Nothing was guaranteed, and survival often meant making do with what could be found. In these instances, the pasty was a comfort nonetheless. The thick pastry would protect the filling, ensuring that the meal could still be carried from place to place without spilling or losing its warmth. It was easy to carry, tucked into a satchel or bundled with a scrap of cloth. The workers, whether on the farms or in the busy marketplaces, could tuck their pasty into their hands and eat as they went about their business, making the most of their few moments of rest. The meat pasty, in all its simplicity, became a beloved snack, especially for those who had to travel long distances or work tirelessly through the day. The soldiers returning from battle or marching to distant towns would carry their pasties as they moved each bite, providing the energy needed to continue. The farmers, at harvest time or in the depths of winter, would wrap a pasty in a cloth and take it into the fields where it could be eaten quickly and without fuss. Even the children playing in the streets would clutch their pasties with both hands, their faces lighting up at the savory flavors within. There was a quiet joy in the portability of the pasty. It was a snack that could be shared, passed around among friends or family. Though it was not a feast, it was filling a reminder that despite the hardships of the day, there was always food to be had. And food, as simple as it may be, had the power to bring people together. It was the great equalizer available to all, from the poorest serf to the wealthiest noble. In the grand feasts of the nobility, pasties took on a more festive form. These were carefully prepared, filled with tender meats and delicate spices served in beautiful crusts that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. But for the majority, the pasty remained a workman's meal, sturdy, simple, and always nourishing. The smell of a freshly baked pasty was a comfort one that carried with it the promise of warmth and satisfaction. The crust, though thick, was perfectly crisp on the outside, the meat inside moist and savory, the vegetables cooked tender. And as the pasty was torn open, the steam would rise, carrying with it the scent of roasted meat, onions, and herbs mingling with the smoky fragrance of the fire. And yet, despite its humble origins, the pasty held an important place in medieval society. It was not just food. It was a symbol of the hard-working folk who had little but gave everything. The pasty was a creation born of necessity, crafted with care, and often filled with whatever was available. Yet in that simplicity, it became something greater, something that carried the stories of those who made it and ate it, a food that spoke of survival and solidarity. It was the snack for travelers and workers alike, a food that could be shared between strangers, passed hand to hand without ceremony. It was the food of the long journey of the laboring day, of the quiet moments in the fields when time seemed to slow. It was a snack for all, a meal made portable, made simple, and made for the life that had no time for finery. It was the medieval hot pocket, easy to carry and simple to consume, offering comfort in the midst of toil. And as the pasty was eaten, there was a fleeting moment of relief, a brief respite from the hard work of the day. The crust would crumble, and the filling, hearty and savory, would warm the body from the inside. Though the pasty was never fancy, it was always enough. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest pleasures are found in the simplest things. The banquet hall was dimly lit by flickering candles, their flames casting dancing shadows upon the stone walls. The sound of soft laughter and the clinking of goblets filled the air, mingling with the rich aroma of roasted meats and spiced wine. This was a time of indulgence, a time when even the simplest pleasures could take on the air of luxury. And amid the grandeur of the feast, there was one small yet significant offering, a delicate dish of candied fennel seeds. These seeds, with their gentle licorice-like flavor, had long been treasured for their unique taste and their ability to cleanse the palate. They were simple enough, yet held a quiet importance in the rituals of medieval hospitality. After the hearty fare of the feast had been consumed, hearty stews, roasted fowl, and rich pies, the fennel seeds would be served often as the meal came to its close, offering a final soothing touch to the evening. The preparation was simple yet precise. Fennel seeds, small and aromatic, were carefully gathered from the plant's feathery green stalks, their fragrance rich with the scent of anise and herbs. These seeds, once collected, were coated with a light dusting of sugar, turning their otherwise delicate form into something sweet and tempting. The sugar would form a glossy coating, a crystalline sheen that sparkled in the candlelight, giving the seeds an almost magical appearance. It was a small indulgence, something that could be held between the fingers, nibbled slowly, and savored with quiet pleasure. The flavor of the candied fennel seeds was both familiar and unexpected. The bite of the fennel, with its licorice-like sharpness, balanced perfectly with the sweetness of the sugar coating. Each seed, small as it was, offered a satisfying burst of flavor, a mix of freshness and sweetness that lingered gently on the tongue. The sweetness was not overwhelming, but subtle, like the whisper of a summer breeze. The licorice taste was soothing, like a moment of calm after a storm of richer flavors. It was a flavor that refreshed the mouth, that cleansed the senses after the heavy, savory meals that had come before. But the fennel seed was not just a sweet treat. It had a purpose. In the medieval world, where the art of cooking was intertwined with medicine and lore, fennel was known not only for its flavor, but also for its medicinal properties. It was said to aid in digestion, easing the discomfort that sometimes followed a rich meal. A handful of these candied seeds, consumed after a heavy feast, could settle the stomach, offering relief from the fullness that followed indulgence. They were a food that cared for the body as well as the senses, and there was more to their significance than their ability to refresh. In the noble households, where every detail was considered part of the experience, the candied fennel seeds were often served to guests at the end of a meal. They were a gesture of hospitality, an offering of comfort and care. The noble host, with a practiced hand, would pass around small dishes of these seeds, inviting guests to take a handful before they left the table. It was a small thing, yet it spoke volumes about the host's attention to detail and the regard they had for their guests. The seeds served after the feast were often accompanied by sweet wine or a final course of fruit. The simplicity of the fennel seeds, with their subtle sweetness and refreshing bite, offered a moment of stillness after the flurry of activity that had come before. The guests, having dined well and enjoyed the festivities, could now enjoy a small pleasure, a final indulgence that soothed both the body and the mind. For those of lower status, the candied fennel seeds were not a luxury reserved for grand feasts, but they were still a beloved treat. The seeds, which could be easily obtained, might be sweetened at home by those with a little extra honey or sugar. For these people, the fennel seeds were often consumed more for their practical uses, offering a respite from the heavy meals of bread and porridge that made up most of their diet. The seeds could be carried in a small pouch and eaten on the go, offering refreshment and a moment of ease during a long, hard day. But whether served in the great halls of nobility or in the humble kitchens of the village, the candied fennel seeds played an important role. They were a part of the rhythm of the medieval meal. a small touch, a quiet pleasure that offered a moment of indulgence without excess. In a world where food could often be a matter of survival, the fennel seeds reminded those who partook in them that even the simplest of foods could carry with them a sense of ritual of care and of thoughtfulness. The sensation of eating these seeds was soothing too. The small crunch of each seed was a pleasant contrast to the soft sweetness of the sugar coating. The flavor, which could have been too sharp or too sweet, found a perfect balance, neither too overwhelming nor too subtle, but just enough to bring about a sense of calm. And as the seeds were eaten slowly, one by one, they seemed to draw out the lingering memories of the meal, leaving only the quiet satisfaction of the evening behind. Candied fennel seeds, in all their simplicity, were a reminder of the quiet pleasures that could be found in even the most ordinary foods. They were a link between the past and the present, a reminder of how throughout history, food had served not just to nourish the body, but to bring people together, to offer comfort, and to provide moments of grace amidst the bustle of daily life. Whether served at the close of a grand feast or eaten quietly in the fields, they carried with them the essence of hospitality and care. And in that small moment, with the faint taste of licorice and sweetness on the tongue, the world seemed just a little bit brighter. As the candles flickered low, casting long shadows upon the walls, the last of the fennel seeds were passed around and the feast came to its natural end. The guests, feeling both satisfied and at ease, rose from the table with contented smiles, their breath fresh and their spirits light. The humble fennel seed, with its simple sweetness and ancient history, had done its work. It had been more than just a food. It had been a ritual, a gift, and a moment of shared indulgence. In the world of the medieval feast, it was the perfect conclusion, a quiet punctuation to an evening filled with flavor and camaraderie. In the cool, quiet morning light, the village could be seen stirring from its slumber. The sounds of distant roosters crowing and the soft murmur of people preparing for the day filled the air as the sun began to creep over the horizon. Yet even in the early hours, the scent of something sweet was already drifting from the hearths of the wealthier households. It was the scent of honey cake, a treat that could bring a quiet smile to the face of the common folk and the nobility alike. Honey cake, though simple in its ingredients, was a food wrapped in symbolism and significance. In a world where sweet treats were rare and often expensive, the honey cake was a testament to both the natural bounty of the land and the wealth of those who could afford to indulge in its rich sweetness. At its core, it was a humble creation, flower, water, and honey, yet it carried with it a depth that made it beloved in both humble kitchens and the grand halls of feasts. The main ingredient, honey, was the star of the cake. Harvested from the beehives that dotted the countryside, it was a sweet treasure, one that could only be gathered with patience and care. The honey, golden and thick, would be poured carefully into the mixture, its warmth and sweetness filling the room. It was said that the best honey cakes were made with honey gathered during the summer months when the flowers were in full bloom and the bees had worked tirelessly to collect the nectar. This honey, rich in flavor, would form the base of the cake, giving it its characteristic sweetness and depth. Flour milled from the grain grown in the fields would be mixed into the honey, forming a dense, thick batter. The addition of water helped bind the ingredients together, creating a consistency that was firm but not dry. The cake, once mixed, would be placed into a simple pan and set near the hearth to bake. The heat from the fire would transform the dough, turning it golden brown on the outside, while the inside remained firm and sticky. The texture was unlike the light, airy cakes of today. It was dense, hearty, and satisfying like the earth itself. The aroma, as the honey cake baked, was both sweet and comforting, a warm, inviting scent that filled the air with the promise of something indulgent. It was a scent that could draw people from across the house, making them pause and linger for just a moment, allowing the sweetness to fill their senses. The smell of honey mingling with the earthy scent of flour and the faint heat of the fire created a sense of warmth and contentment that was difficult to resist. Though simple, the honey cake held a special place in medieval society. It was a treat that symbolized the wealth of the household. Honey was not something that could be acquired easily, and only those of means had the resources to enjoy it in abundance. To bake a honey cake was a sign of prosperity, a gesture that spoke of abundance and comfort. For the wealthy, the honey cake might be spiced with cinnamon cloves or nutmeg, their fragrant aromas adding another layer of richness to the cake. Sometimes, dried fruits such as raisins or figs would be mixed into the batter, giving the cake a hint of tartness to balance the sweetness. These additions elevated the cake, making it not only a treat, but a symbol of luxury and abundance. For the common folk, however, the honey cake remained a simpler dish. Made with only honey flour and water, it was a modest indulgence, one that could be enjoyed during festivals or as a special gift. It was often served during celebrations, a food that marked a moment of joy or accomplishment. Weddings, births, and harvest festivals were times when the honey cake would make its appearance, offered to guests as a token of good fortune and happiness. It was a food that marked the passing of time, a symbol of the sweetness that could be found in life's small victories. The texture of the honey cake was both dense and sticky. It could be sliced into thick wedges, each piece holding together with a satisfying firmness. The honey's sweetness, though ever present, was not overpowering. Instead, it lingered gently on the tongue, a reminder of the work that had gone into the cake's creation. The cake, when eaten fresh, would melt in the mouth, leaving a rich, lingering sweetness that could be savored slowly. It was the kind of cake that invited contemplation, its density offering a sense of fullness and satisfaction that lingered long after the last bite. Though the honey cake was often eaten at feasts and festivals, it also had a cultural role to play. It was a common gift presented by the host to guests as a sign of hospitality. When offered to a visitor, the honey cake was a way of saying, "You are welcome here. You are part of the joy we share." It was not just a food, but a gesture of goodwill and warmth. In the villages, it was often passed around at the end of a gathering, the last taste of sweetness after a hearty meal. The honey cake in its simplicity offered a moment of pause, a quiet reminder that even in the midst of hardship, there could be moments of indulgence. The popularity of the honey cake spread far and wide, becoming a staple of medieval celebrations. It was a food of the people, a dish that could be enjoyed by both rich and poor, though the richness of the cake varied, depending on the wealth of the household. The more affluent families might bake cakes that were spiced or decorated with candied fruits, while the simpler cakes of the poor would be less ornate but no less cherished. In both cases, the honey cake was a treat to be savored, a food that symbolized not just sweetness, but the enduring hope of prosperity and happiness. In the grand halls of nobles, where feasts stretched late into the night and laughter echoed off stone walls, the honey cake held a place of honor. After the last course of meat and stew had been cleared away, the cake would make its entrance carried on a silver platter or set upon a wooden board. The guests, having enjoyed the rich offerings of the feast, would eagerly reach for a piece, their hands taking the thick slices with reverence. It was a sweet end to a night of indulgence, a food that spoke of abundance and plenty. Yet in the more modest homes, the honey cake was no less treasured. It was a food that marked moments of joy and celebration, a treat that, despite its simplicity, could make even the hardest days seem a little brighter. Whether baked in the hearth of a noble manor or in the humble kitchens of the village, the honey cake brought with it a sense of sweetness that transcended its ingredients. It was not just the honey that made the cake special. It was the love and care with which it was made and the joy it brought to those who ate it. As the days passed, the honey cake became more than just a food. It became a symbol of hospitality, of community, and of the simple pleasures that could be found in a world of hardship. It was a reminder that in the end, life was about more than just survival. It was about the sweetness that could be found even in the most difficult of times. And in the honey cake, that sweetness was both simple and profound, a food that offered comfort, warmth, and a moment of indulgence amidst the demands of life. The sea, ever vast and mysterious, stretched out beyond the small coastal village, where the salty wind whipped through the streets, carrying the scent of brine and seaweed. In the morning light, the fishermen could be seen hauling their nets ashore, their boats creaking against the waves as they brought in the day's catch. The air was filled with the noise of labor, shouting voices, the slap of fish against wood, and the rhythm of life shaped by the sea. Yet amidst this busy routine, there was a simple and humble pleasure found in the simplest of places, beneath the firelight, in the hearths of the homes where fish skin was transformed into something far more than waste. The process of making fried fish skin cracklings was a simple one. After the fish had been cleaned and filleted, the skins, often discarded as unworthy of the table, were set aside. No part of the catch went to waste in these modest kitchens. The skins were rinsed, cleaned of any remaining scales, and then sliced into strips, or left in their whole form, depending on the preference of the cook. The frying pan, blackened with years of use, was filled with oil, and once the heat was just right, the fish skin would be dropped in the oil, sizzling around it like a small storm. The fish skin, once submerged in the bubbling oil, would begin to crisp and curl its rough surface, turning golden and brittle. The oil clung to the skin, turning it into something rich and satisfying. The cracklings, once removed from the oil and drained, were left to cool their surface, crisp and shining, salted lightly to bring out the natural, savory flavors of the fish. What had once been a byproduct of the fishing process was now a simple yet indulgent snack, one that was crispy, salty, and full of the unmistakable taste of the sea. When eaten, the fried fish skin cracklings were as much about the sensation as the flavor. The texture was sharp and crunchy, the skin breaking apart easily under the pressure of teeth, its crispiness releasing an intense salty flavor. The fishiness was strong, immediate, and unmistakable, but it was tempered by the salt, which brought out the best in the fish's natural richness. The oil clung to the fingers, leaving behind a trace of flavor long after the last bite was taken. Each piece of crackling was a small indulgence, providing a satisfying crunch. With every bite, the flavors of the sea lingering on the tongue, rich and comforting. But the fried fish skin cracklings were more than just a snack. They were a practical food, one born from necessity. Sailors, with their long voyages across the waves, needed sustenance that was both filling and easy to store. The cracklings were perfect for this. Packed with fat, they provided the high energy needed to endure the hardships of life at sea. They were lightweight, simple to carry, and could be eaten quickly between shifts of rowing or mending sails. When there was little else to eat, these cracklings could be counted on to satisfy hunger, to offer warmth against the cold winds, or to provide the quick burst of energy needed to keep going. For the fishermen and the villagers living by the sea, the cracklings were no less important. After a long day spent hauling in fish, repairing nets, or preparing the catch, a handful of these crispy bites would be enough to take the edge off hunger. The salty fish skin would fill the stomach, offering a quick respite before the next task had to be undertaken. It was not a food for feasts or festivals, but it was a food for life. A small pleasure in the midst of labor. In the kitchen, the cracklings might be served alongside a slice of bread, or perhaps a bowl of porridge, but often they were enjoyed alone, simply salted and eaten by hand. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the fire burned low and the shadows stretched across the floor, a fisherman or sailor might lean back in his chair, a small pile of fish skin cracklings before him, savoring the crunch with each bite. There was little fanfare in such moments, but there was comfort, a reassurance that despite the hard work and long hours, something small and simple could bring satisfaction. The social role of the fried fish skin cracklings was straightforward, cheap filling, and easy to prepare. In the world of the medieval kitchen, where resources were often scarce, the cracklings provided a way to turn something that might have been discarded into a food that was both useful and satisfying. They were not the elegant morsels served at royal tables or the lavish dishes prepared for feasts. Instead, they were the food of the working class, the laborers who found joy in simplicity, the sailors who braved the seas, and the fishermen who depended on the water for their livelihood. And yet, there was a certain elegance in their simplicity. The cracklings were a reminder that even the humblest food could provide a great deal of comfort. They were the kind of food that didn't demand attention, but rather rewarded those who appreciated the quiet pleasure of a good meal. Whether served at the table or eaten on the go, the fried fish skin cracklings held a special place in the hearts of those who worked with the sea. In some ways, the cracklings symbolized the relationship between the people and the sea, a relationship built on respect, hard work, and resourcefulness. The fish caught with skill and care provided not only for the body, but for the spirit, offering sustenance in the most straightforward of ways. The salty cracklings, though far from the grand feasts of nobility, carried the flavors of the sea in each crisp bite, a small taste of the ocean itself. For the villagers who lived by the coast, the cracklings were a constant, a food that appeared after every catch, a food that provided the strength to carry on. It was a food that was as much about survival as it was about the joy of the sea. And in those quiet moments, when the work of the day had come to a close, and the cracklings were enjoyed by firelight, there was a peace in knowing that even the simplest foods could offer something truly special. The cracklings, with their crispiness and saltiness, served as a reminder of the sea's generosity. They were not for special occasions, but for every day. In their crunch, there was a satisfaction that could not be found in more refined foods. They were the food of those who lived by the rhythm of the tides, who understood that life's greatest pleasures often came in the most unassuming forms. And as the night settled over the village, with the sounds of the sea carrying across the shore, the last of the fish skin cracklings would be eaten, their saltiness lingering on the tongue, a small but lasting memory of the day's work. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the fields as the laborers trudged back to their cottages. Their day had been long spent under the weight of hard toil, and now, as evening approached, the promise of rest and sustenance beckoned. The air was cool, a welcome relief from the warmth of the day, and the smells of dinner began to drift from the homes, simple stews simmering on the fire, the hearty scent of bread fresh from the oven, and the faint, unmistakable aroma of ale. It was this last scent that would soon bring comfort to tired bodies, as bread soaked in ale, a humble but cherished dish, was prepared to offer respite. The preparation was a modest one, yet it spoke volumes of the working life. Thick, rustic loaves of bread, made from whatever grain had been harvested or could be afforded, were torn into chunks and soaked in low-alcohol ale. The ale was not the fine brew reserved for feasts, but a more common everyday variety, bitter and hearty. It carried the earthiness of the grain and the lightest traces of hops. This was a drink not for pleasure, but for sustenance, often consumed by the working folk after a long day's labor. The bread, dense and hearty, would soak up the ale, absorbing its bitterness and turning into a soggy yet comforting mass of flavors. The soaked bread would be served in a bowl or on a rough wooden board, the ale blending with the crumbs to create a soft, slightly mushy texture. Sometimes the mixture was seasoned with herbs or spices, a sprinkling of salt or a hint of pepper to add a layer of warmth. In colder months, a dash of dried thyme or rosemary might be stirred in offering a small touch of comfort. The dish was eaten slowly, each bite warm and satisfying, with the ale's bitterness cutting through the dense, hearty bread. The taste was bold, a balance of bitterness and earthiness with a faint sweetness from the bread's yeasty richness. It was not a dish meant to please the palate with delicate flavors, but one designed to nourish and fill. The bitterness of the ale lingered on the tongue, while the bread soaked up the liquid, creating a satisfying weight that filled the stomach. There was something deeply grounding in the combination, a reminder of the earth, of the simple grains that had been harvested and transformed into something that could sustain life. It was food for the body, not the senses, and yet it held a certain comfort all its own. For those in the working class, bread soaked in ale was a common snack after the day's labor. It was not served at feasts or celebrations, but it was welcomed by those who had worked hard in the fields, the blacksmith's forges, or the kitchens of the village. After hours spent in the heat and dust, there was something deeply satisfying in the simplicity of the dish. The bread, dense and filling, would provide the strength needed to rest for the night, while the ale soothed the parched throat and offered a brief escape from the day's exhaustion. For many, it was the first comfort of the evening, the promise of warmth and sustenance after a long day's work. In the winter months, when food was scarcer and the cold seemed to seep into the bones, bread soaked in ale took on a special significance. It became a way to stretch what little food remained a meal that could be eaten when other options were scarce. During fasting periods when meat and richer foods were forbidden, this dish became a practical way of filling the stomach without breaking the rules. Bread ale, and perhaps a handful of herbs or vegetables, were enough to provide the nourishment needed to keep going. It was a simple meal, but it was also one that carried with it a quiet sense of relief, a small moment of ease amidst the hardships. The cultural role of this humble dish was clear. It was a food for the common folk, a symbol of the life they led. In times of plenty, bread soaked in ale was a simple comfort, a snack to enjoy after a day of labor, or as part of a family meal. But in times of scarcity, it was a food that ensured survival, a reminder that even when the larder was bare, the earth could provide. It was a food that could be made with what was on hand, a testament to the resourcefulness of the people who made it. And in that simplicity, it became something deeply cherished, a small act of self-care, a way to nourish both body and spirit. As the bread soaked in ale was eaten, the bitter, hearty flavors seemed to settle the soul. There was a sense of grounding in the dish, as though it connected the eater to the earth itself. The bread, once part of a flourishing crop, now returned to the earth through the body, providing strength and warmth. The ale, too, had its roots in the land, the grains that had been harvested, the water that had been purified, the labor that had gone into each bottle. It was a food that was connected to the land, to the seasons, and to the cycle of work and rest. In the quiet of the evening, when the fire burned low and the village settled into rest, there was a moment of peace in the simple act of eating. The bread soaked in ale offered not just sustenance, but a sense of connection, a reminder of the hard work that had gone into each meal, of the bonds between the people and the earth that fed them. It was not the most extravagant of foods, nor the most refined, but it was one that carried with it the essence of life itself, a food for those who lived by the rhythm of the land, who understood that sustenance was not always about luxury, but about survival and simplicity. The dish had no need for adornment. It was the meal of a tired body, of a life lived in the shadows of labor and toil. But in that simple meal, there was a quiet joy, a satisfaction that came not from indulgence, but from the simple act of nourishment. And as the night deepened and the stars appeared in the cold sky above the last of the bread soaked in ale would be eaten, the warmth of the meal lingering long after the last bite was taken. It was a food that filled the stomach and soothed the soul, a comfort in the truest sense of the word. In the grand hall of the castle, where the flickering firelight danced upon the stone walls, the evening's feast was drawing to a close. The long wooden tables, now cleared of their hearty roasts and roasted meats, were lined with remnants of the evening's indulgences, crumbs of bread, half-empty goblets, and the soft clink of silver utensils. The laughter and conversation had settled into quieter tones. The guests now relaxed after a long evening of merriment. And it was at this time, as the night deepened and the chill crept into the air, that a final treat would be brought forth, an elegant dish known as sops in wine. It was a simple dessert, yet one that carried with it a certain refinement, a dish often seen at banquets, where delicacies were savored and every bite was meant to bring comfort and delight. The preparation was straightforward, yet the act of serving it, the gesture of offering it at the end of the meal, was what made it special. A loaf of bread, usually fresh and hearty, would be torn into chunks, its crust golden and firm, its center soft and slightly porous. The bread would be soaked in a warm bath of wine, either spiced or sweetened, until the liquid was absorbed, transforming the simple bread into something both rich and satisfying. The wine itself was often chosen for its warmth and depth. Spices like cinnamon cloves and nutmeg were sometimes added, giving the wine an aromatic warmth that complemented the bread. The sweetness of the wine, enhanced with a touch of honey or sugar, would seep into the bread, turning it into a comforting, pillowy treat. The heat from the wine would cause the bread to soften, becoming tender and moist, the flavors melding together into a warm, soothing bite. The sops, once prepared, were served in shallow dishes, their golden crusts now softened into something silky and inviting. Each piece of soaked bread glistened, the dark wine seeping through its edges, while the spices added a fragrant, heady aroma to the air. The warm glow of the hearth seemed to wrap itself around the dessert, making the very act of eating the sops a calming, meditative experience. The richness of the wine, the softness of the bread, and the warmth of the spices combined in each bite to create a comforting harmony, one that lingered long after the dessert was consumed. This dish, though humble in its ingredients, was reserved for the most refined occasions. For the elite, so peas and wine were not merely a meal's end, but a treat that symbolized indulgence, elegance, and the art of hospitality. It was not for the peasant, who would likely have no wine to spare, but for those who dined in the great halls, where silver goblets were filled with the finest wine, and the air buzzed with the satisfaction of a full belly. The sops were an invitation to linger at the table to savor the warmth and richness of the meal, and to partake in the joy of indulgence. At formal feasts, where the spread of food was abundant and the evening stretched on into the night, the sops and wine would signal the final course, an end to the revelry, but also a transition to a quieter, more reflective time. Guests would lean back in their chairs, perhaps dabbing their mouths with linen napkins, and savor the last bites of the meal. The dessert would be served delicately, often passed around by servants who carried silver trays laden with shallow bowls. The sops were the food of relaxation, eaten slowly, savored for both their warmth and their simplicity. The flavor of the esops was rich and enveloping. The wine's bitterness was softened by the sweetness, the spices adding a layer of complexity that warmed the throat with each sip. The bread, once hearty and solid, had now become something delicate and tender, its texture softened by the wine. It was as if the bread had been transformed into a vessel, for the rich flavors of the wine absorbing them completely, until each bite was a warm, soothing experience. The sweetness of the wine, the aroma of the spices, and the richness of the soaked bread all melded together into a dessert that felt like a gentle hug from within. For the noble families, this dessert was more than a treat. It was a statement. It was a way of showing hospitality, a way to offer guests not just food, but an experience. The presentation of the SOPs and wine was as much about the act of sharing as it was about the food itself. It was a sign that the evening had been enjoyed, that the hosts had given their guests the best of what they could offer. The esops were a final gesture of generosity, the last indulgence before the night came to a close. As the sops were eaten, the conversation in the hall softened. The guests, full from the meal, now enjoyed the quiet comfort of the dessert. Some would linger, savoring the flavors, while others would rise from the table, their bellies satisfied and their spirits content. The fire in the hearth would crackle quietly, the shadows growing longer as the night wore on. The sops and wine, though a simple dish, had served their purpose. They had provided warmth, comfort, and a sense of ending to the evening. The guests would leave the table with a quiet satisfaction, the taste of the wine and the sweetness of the bread still lingering in their mouths. The dish, though simple, carried with it the weight of tradition. It had been served at feasts for centuries, a food that marked the end of a meal and the beginning of a restful evening. In its rich simplicity, it connected those who ate it to a long history of hospitality and indulgence. It was a dish that transcended its ingredients, becoming something greater than bread and wine. It was a moment to savor, to reflect, and to enjoy the warmth of the evening, surrounded by the company of friends and fellow guests. And as the last crumbs of the esops were eaten, the guests would rise from the table, their satisfaction complete. The sops and wine had fulfilled their purpose, not only as a dessert, but as a symbol of the comfort and luxury that could be found in the simplest of foods. In the warmth of the hearth, in the soft glow of the candles, the last of the wine would be sipped, and the evening would draw to a close. As the first chill of winter settled over the village, the scent of dried fruit filled the air, sweet, rich, and reminiscent of warmer days. The fruits once plucked from the trees in the height of summer or early autumn had been carefully dried and stored for the colder months. They were a luxury of their time, treasured for their sweetness, and their rarity for fresh fruit could rarely be found in winter. The main varieties of dried fruit in the medieval world were dates, figs, raisins, and prunes, each a symbol of wealth and prosperity, especially in the colder northern regions where such fruits were not native. Dates with their dark glossy skins came from the far-off lands of the east. Figs, plump and purple, were cultivated in the Mediterranean climates. Raisins, dried grapes, were often made from the harvests of the local vines, and prunes, dry and wrinkled, their deep purple color, rich with history, came from the plums that grew in the gardens of the nobility. The process of drying the fruit was simple yet laborious. In the warm months, when the sun hung high in the sky, the fruits would be carefully picked, washed, and laid out to dry on flat stones or wicker mats. Sometimes they would be placed in the shade to dry slowly, other times in the open sun, where the heat of the day would shrink and concentrate their sweetness. The drying process preserved the fruit, making it possible to store it for months, even years. The water was drawn out, leaving behind the dense, chewy flesh, the sweetness more concentrated than ever before. Once dried, the fruit would be gathered and stored in cool, dry places, usually in wooden boxes, sometimes sealed in cloth pouches or earthenware jars. These sweet treasures were often reserved for special occasions when the harvests were finished and the long winter months stretched ahead. They were not foods to be eaten lightly, but rather to be savored and enjoyed in small amounts, a treat that could be brought out at banquets or feasts or when guests arrived at the hearth. At feasts, dried fruits were often displayed in bowls or laid out on platters, their colors gleaming in the soft light of the candles. They were served as a final sweet course, a gift to the guests after the heavy meats and savory dishes of the evening. They would be eaten slowly, each bite dense with flavor, their sweetness lingering on the tongue, a reminder of the warmth of summer, even in the dead of winter. But for the common folk, dried fruit was not just a luxury, it was a necessity during times when fresh produce was unavailable. In the villages, dried figs and raisins might be mixed into porridge, offering a rare burst of sweetness. Dates, too, were sometimes added to stews, their rich flavor, bringing depth to the hearty, savory meals that sustained the working class during the cold months. For those traveling long distances, dried fruit became a vital foodstuff, a compact, easy-to-carry sustenance that could be taken on long journeys across the countryside. The taste of dried fruit was something to be savored. Dates with their rich, almost caramel-like sweetness were dense and sticky, their flesh smooth and soft. Figs, when dried, were chewy and slightly earthy, with a subtle sweetness that deepened as it lingered. Raisins, small and shriveled, were bursting with sugar, and prunes, their skins wrinkled and dark, carried an intense sweetness that could satisfy even the most insistent cravings. The texture, though chewy, was satisfying in its own way, each bite a slow, deliberate experience. The sweetness of the fruit filled the mouth, but it was not the delicate sweetness of fresh fruit. It was heavier, more concentrated, like a reminder of the work that had gone into preserving the fruit, and a reflection of the labor involved in bringing it to the table. In times of celebration, dried fruit became a symbol of abundance, of a meal that marked something special. Whether served in the great halls of the nobility or shared among friends in a humble cottage, the dried fruit was a small luxury that spoke of generosity and hospitality. It was not just a food, but a gift, one that could be shared, passed from hand to hand, a mark of kindness and thoughtfulness. The fruit itself was often used in the making of sweet pastries, pies, and cakes, where its flavor could be enhanced by the addition of spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, all of which further elevated its richness. During religious holidays and feasts, dried fruits were a common delicacy. Christmas, Easter, and harvest celebrations were often marked by the presence of dates, figs, and raisins, which were eaten to symbolize the fullness of life and the blessings of the harvest. They were sweet, yes, but also tied to the seasons, to the cycles of the earth. The dried fruit was a reminder of the work that had gone into the harvests, the labor of the farmer, the patience of the gardener, and the gratitude that came with the food it provided. Beyond their cultural significance, dried fruits also had a practical role. They could be stored for long periods, allowing them to be consumed during times of scarcity. In the colder months, when fresh food was hard to come by, the preserved fruit provided a small luxury that lifted the spirits, a treat to break the monotony of bread and pottage. For the traveler, the dried fruit became a lifeline, a compact, nutrient-rich snack that could be carried for days or weeks without spoiling. Whether on a pilgrimage, a journey to trade, or simply traveling between villages, a small pouch of dried fruit could provide both comfort and nourishment. As the evening drew to a close, the guests would sit back, their bellies full from the hearty meal, and take a moment to enjoy the dried fruit. The sweet, dense morsels would be eaten slowly with care, their flavors deep and rich in the quiet of the evening. For a moment, it seemed as though the warmth of summer had returned with the sweetness of the dates, figs, raisins, and prunes filling the room with their comfort. Dried fruit, though simple in its origins, was far more than just food. It was a connection to the past, the memories of harvests and labor of the land that had provided. It was a symbol of endurance, of patience, and of the pleasures that could be found even in the most humble things. It was the essence of the seasons preserved in the sweetness of a raisin or the richness of a date. Each bite was a reminder of the earth's generosity and the way that food, no matter how simple, could bring comfort, joy, and a sense of abundance. The cold of the early morning crept in through the cracks in the stone walls, a chill that lingered long after the sun had risen. The hearth fire, though crackling with heat, could not quite hold the frost at bay, yet it brought warmth to the humble kitchen where the day's first meal was being prepared. The scent of sizzling fat filled the air, a savory, inviting fragrance that spoke of comfort and sustenance. It was here, in the heart of the working-class household, that blood pudding balls were being fried, one of the simplest yet most nourishing dishes of the medieval world. The preparation was straightforward, though it required the knowledge of a skilled hand. Animal blood, fresh from the slaughter, was the base of the dish. Often, pig's blood, dark and rich, would be carefully collected and poured into a wooden bowl, the deep, almost coppery hue of it setting the tone for the earthy meal to come. Oats, sturdy and filling, would be mixed into the blood, their rough texture giving the dish substance. The onions, sliced thin and slightly caramelized, would add sweetness and depth, while a blend of spices, perhaps a pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, and a hint of thyme, would infuse the mixture with warmth and flavor. It was a simple, humble concoction, one born of necessity and the desire to make use of every part of the animal. Once the mixture was ready, it would be formed into small balls, their shape uneven and rustic, each one compact and hearty. The small balls would be gently dropped into a pan of sizzling fat, where they would fry slowly, their outer skins turning golden brown and crisp. The heat from the fat would render the richness of the blood, making the balls tender on the inside, while the oats helped to hold the shape, giving them a satisfying chew. As they fried, the scent would become more pronounced, the earthy aroma of the blood mingling with the sizzling fat, creating a mouth-watering fragrance that would fill the room and tempt all who were near. The cooking process was not delicate, but it was effective. The fat would coat each blood pudding ball, giving it a rich sheen, while the frying would seal in the flavor. The heat would penetrate the mixture, turning it into something that could be eaten by hand, hearty and dense. A meal that was both filling and nourishing. When done, the balls would be lifted from the pan and drained on a cloth, their exterior crispy, their insides soft and earthy rich, with the taste of the animal from which they had come. The texture was as substantial as the flavor. The outside of the pudding balls would crackle slightly when bitten, offering a satisfying crunch, while the interior would give way to a soft, dense mixture, the oats melding with the blood and spices to create a filling, almost pudding-like consistency. The flavor was unmistakable, earthy, rich, and hearty, with the faint sweetness of the onions and the warmth of the spices. It was a taste that lingered on the tongue, full of depth and substance, and often so filling that a small portion was enough to satisfy hunger for hours. For the working class, blood pudding balls were not just a treat, they were a necessary source of nutrition. In the colder months, when fresh vegetables were scarce and meat was not always readily available, blood pudding offered a way to make use of what the animal provided. Rich in iron and protein, the blood served as a vital component in the diet of those who labored long hours in the fields or in the kitchens where strength and endurance were needed. The oats helped to bulk up the dish, making it more filling, while the fat provided the necessary calories to keep the body warm and energized during the hard winter months. Blood pudding balls were often eaten for breakfast, paired with a piece of hearty bread and perhaps a small cup of ale. The warmth of the dish, both in temperature and in flavor, provided a sense of comfort and sustenance that could carry one through the first part of the day's work. They were eaten in the early morning just as the sun began to rise over the frost-covered ground, or perhaps later in the day when hunger had built up after hours of labor. The cultural role of blood pudding balls was significant, especially in the colder months. In the villages where the land could be harsh and the winters long, this dish was a way to ensure that no part of the animal was wasted. It was a food that sustained, that gave energy, and that helped the workers of the land carry on through their grueling routines. Blood pudding was not a food for feasts or celebrations, but rather for those who lived by the sweat of their brow and the labor of their hands. Though humble in its origins, the blood pudding ball held a certain reverence among the people who ate it. It was not a dish of luxury, but of necessity, practical and sustaining. For the laborers and the farmers, it was a food that provided the strength to keep going, the nutrients needed to face another long day of work. It was a food tied to the seasons and the rhythms of rural life. In the halls of the nobility, blood pudding was rarely seen. The rich would dine on meats roasted with spices, pastries, stuffed with sweet fillings, and dishes that dazzled with flavor and presentation. But for the common folk, blood pudding balls were a reminder of the cycle of life of the animals they raised, the land they tilled, and the food that could be made from even the simplest ingredients. It was a meal of substance meant to nourish and fortify, not to delight in lightness or refinement. Blood pudding balls, often made in large batches, would be eaten not only by the immediate family, but also shared with friends and neighbors. It was a dish that brought people together, one that required little preparation, but offered great sustenance. Whether served at the table of a small cottage or passed among a group of workers, the blood pudding was a reminder of the interconnectedness of the people, the land, and the animals that they relied on. As the last of the blood pudding balls were eaten, the sense of warmth would linger, both from the food itself and from the sense of comfort it provided. The simple, earthy meal was a reminder of the importance of sustenance, of making do with what was available, and of the ways in which food could connect people to their environment and to each other. And in the quiet moments after the meal, as the fire crackled and the work of the day began, there was a deep sense of satisfaction, a fullness that went beyond the body, a contentment born of the simple pleasures found in a hearty meal. The dawn had just begun to break, casting a pale light over the sleepy village. The first sounds of the day drifted through the air, the creaking of wooden carts, the soft bleating of sheep in the distance, and the murmur of voices as the villagers stirred to life. In the small kitchens, where the warmth of the hearth could be felt through the stone walls, the simple sound of a skillet sizzling was one of the first notes of the morning. The meal was a humble one, but one that would sustain a person through the early hours of the day. Medieval pancakes, thick and hearty, sizzling in the pan. Made from flour eggs and a splash of water or ale, medieval pancakes were far from the delicate thin crepes of later centuries. They were thick and filling, meant to give strength and energy to those who ate them. The ingredients, though basic, could be found in almost every kitchen, making them a practical and affordable meal for the common folk. The flour was often whole grain, milled from the wheat grown in the fields, and the eggs came from the chickens kept in the yard. The ale, sometimes added for a touch of richness, would be whatever was brewed locally, low in alcohol, yet enough to give the pancakes a depth of flavor that could not be achieved with water alone. The pancakes were cooked on a simple iron griddle or in a heavy pan. The fat from a nearby animal often rendered lard sizzling as it hit the hot metal. The batter, thick and sticky, was poured onto the pan, spreading slowly into rough, uneven circles. The pancakes were hearty, their edges sometimes slightly burnt, but always with a satisfying crispness. As the batter cooked, the scent of warm bread filled the room. The slight bitterness of the flour mixing with the richness of the eggs and the subtle sweetness of the ale. It was a simple, earthy aroma, one that spoke of early mornings and modest comforts. As the pancakes cooked, they would slowly change from a pale dough into something golden brown and inviting. The surface would firm, the edges crisping slightly, while the center remained thick and chewy, like bread still in the process of rising. The pancakes, though often rough in shape, had a satisfying heft to them. Each one was thick enough to fill the stomach, yet not so heavy that it could not be eaten in one sitting. When flipped, the other side would brown quickly, the smell of sizzling fat and bread growing stronger. The pancakes were done when they were golden and crisp, their surfaces slightly uneven but always inviting. The texture of these pancakes was hearty, chewy, thick, and substantial. They were not light, airy delicacies, but rather a solid meal that could sustain the body through the long hours of the day. The slight burn at the edges added an earthy, almost smoky flavor to the pancakes, balancing the sweetness of the batter. The inside was soft but dense, like the texture of thick bread dough, and the flavor was rich, warm, and slightly savory. With each bite, the pancakes would fill the mouth, their heft and warmth offering a grounding comfort. Though they were a breakfast food, medieval pancakes were versatile. They could be eaten both sweet and savory, depending on what was available. For the wealthy, the pancakes might be served with honey or sugar, a rare treat that added sweetness and richness to the otherwise simple meal. For those of more modest means, the pancakes might be paired with a dollop of butter or a sprinkle of salt, sometimes served with a side of cheese or fruit if available. In some instances, savory pancakes would be made with herbs or onions, creating a meal that was both hearty and satisfying. The toppings varied from household to household, but the base, thick, dense, and filling remained the same. Medieval pancakes were a common sight during Lent, when meat and rich foods were often forbidden. The simplicity of the pancake made it a perfect choice during this period, as it could be eaten without breaking the rules of the fast. They were also an affordable meal, a quick and easy way to feed the family when resources were scarce. The pancakes could be made from whatever ingredients were on hand, flour, eggs, and water, and were often eaten in large quantities to fill the stomachs of those who worked the land or labored in the fields. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, the villagers might sit together at the table, sharing pancakes as a simple but satisfying meal. It was not a dish for lavish feasts or grand celebrations, but it was a dish of sustenance. The pancakes would be served warm, their golden brown surfaces glistening slightly with fat, their aroma comforting and inviting. The table, humble but sturdy, would be crowded with bowls of herbs butter or small jugs of honey, each person making the pancakes their own, with whatever toppings were available. The rich, filling flavor of the pancakes would serve as a reminder of the simple pleasures in life, the warmth of food, the comfort of shared company, and the satisfaction of a meal that could keep hunger at bay. For the working-class, medieval pancakes were a daily treat eaten with whatever toppings could be found. They were especially common during the winter months when fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce, and the diet often consisted of the heartier foods that could be stored or preserved. These pancakes could be eaten in the early morning to provide energy for the long day ahead, or later in the day when hunger struck. They were easy to make, requiring only a few simple ingredients, and were filling enough to provide the strength needed for the day's tasks. The pancakes were also enjoyed during special occasions. On festival days, when the villages gathered to celebrate the harvest, or a religious holiday, pancakes might be served alongside meats and stews. For the wealthier folk, the pancakes might be made with finer flour, or enriched with spices, their surfaces decorated with sugar or fruits. But for the majority, the pancakes remained a simple, honest food one that could be enjoyed with a bit of honey butter or salt, depending on the available resources. As the pancakes were eaten, their warmth would settle in the stomach, a comforting weight that filled the body and offered a sense of satisfaction. The hearty, chewy texture would soothe, while the rich, earthy flavor would linger on the tongue. The simplicity of the meal was its charm. It was not fussy or refined, but it was nourishing and grounding, offering the perfect respite from the day's labors. There was something deeply satisfying in the act of eating a medieval pancake, a connection to the past and to the generations who had relied on this simple dish to carry them through. In the quiet of the evening, as the fire burned low and the last of the pancakes were eaten, there would be a sense of contentment, a fullness that came not just from the meal, but from the quiet rhythm of life itself. The pancakes, thick and chewy, had provided a foundation for the day, and as the villagers cleaned their plates and settled down for the night, they would rest easy, knowing that they had been nourished, not just by the food, but by the simple pleasure of a meal shared among family and friends. As the flickering light of the hearth danced against the stone walls of the medieval kitchens, the smell of hearty stews, fresh bread, and sizzling meats would fill the air, welcoming all who entered with the promise of sustenance and comfort. Yet amid these robust meals, there existed another world of food, a world that didn't make grand appearances at the banquet tables of royalty, but rather quietly nourished the common folk. These were the humble medieval snacks, which, though simple and often overlooked by history, provided a vital lifeline to those who lived in a time of toil, struggle, and scarcity. Medieval junk food, while not as glamorous or refined as the feasts fit for kings, was practical, hearty, and often a necessity for survival. These small, yet significant snacks were crafted from ingredients that could be found in nearly every household flower. eggs, honey oats, vegetables, and meat scraps. What was once thought of as simple or even wasteful was transformed into sustenance by the resourceful hands of the medieval cooks. From the chewy, earthy blood pudding balls that provided vital iron for the working class, to the crispy, salty fish skin cracklings that offered sailors a hearty, portable snack, these foods were not designed for luxury, but for necessity. As we look back at these medieval snacks, we can see that despite their simplicity, they laid the groundwork for what would later become the global culinary traditions we know today. Just as modern snacks offer us a quick energy boost during busy days, these medieval foods served a similar function. In a world without fast food chains, refrigerators, or supermarkets, every meal, every snack was a deliberate act of survival, a way to ensure that both the body and the spirit were sustained during long hours of labor and hard work. Take, for example, the humble apple fritter, which may have been fried in reused oil, but offered a quick burst of sweetness and energy to the laborer. These crispy golden treats were not just an indulgence, but a necessary part of daily life, providing much-needed calories to keep going. The same could be said for the hearty turnip pie, a poor man's dessert that, while often bland, could be sweetened to offer a rare and welcome treat. It was simple filling and could stretch through hard times when food was scarce. In those moments of sweetness, a small comfort could be found even in the harshest conditions. Then there were the cheese curds, simple yet satisfying, offering a chewy, squeaky texture that could be eaten on the go. These curds were not a luxury, but a practical snack consumed by travelers and peasants alike, often serving as a quick fix during long hours on the road or in the fields. Despite their unassuming nature, cheese curds became symbolic of the ways medieval folk were able to turn the simplest ingredients into something that could provide nourishment and comfort, however fleeting. As we move through time, we encounter the meat pasty, another example of a medieval snack that served as both practicality and indulgence. Whether filled with mutton, rabbit, or even vegetables, these thick pastry pockets were portable, easy to carry, and filled with nutrients. They became the snack of workers and travelers, handheld sustenance that could be eaten on the move. The portability of the pasty mirrored the mobility of the medieval world, where workers, soldiers, and traders alike relied on quick, hearty food to keep them going between their duties and travels. In addition, there were the more luxurious medieval snacks, such as candied fennel seeds, which served not only as a sweet indulgence, but also as a digestive aid meant to refresh the breath and ease the stomach after a hearty meal. These simple, sugary bites were often served to guests at noble feasts, and they held a cultural significance that transcended their humble nature. The offering of fennel seeds was a gesture of hospitality, one that spoke of both wealth and generosity. Amidst these rich, savory offerings, there were the indulgent honey cakes, dense, sticky, and sweet, made from honey flower and water. The honey cake carried with it the symbolism of wealth, especially when spiced or mixed with dried fruits. It was a common treat at feasts and festivals, given as a gift or shared amongst friends and family during joyous occasions. In their sweetness, honey cakes offered not just a moment of pleasure, but a sense of comfort and prosperity in a world that was often harsh and demanding. As we near the end of our journey through these medieval snacks, we come to realize that each bite, each morsel, was far more than just food. It was a symbol of the resilience of the people who lived in such times. Whether it was the savory, iron-rich blood pudding balls or the comforting, humble bread soaked in ale, medieval snacks provided not just physical sustenance, but emotional comfort. They were an expression of creativity and resourcefulness in a time when food was scarce and nothing could be wasted. These snacks were not designed to please the palate with elegance or refinement. Instead, they were meant to sustain, to nourish, and to bring people together. They were foods that could be shared between neighbors after a long day's work, or served as a gesture of hospitality to welcome guests into one's home. They were the foundation of daily life, the simple pleasures that made the hardships of medieval existence a little more bearable. And in a world where food was often the difference between life and death, these snacks were a reminder that survival was not just about filling one's stomach, but also about finding joy in the small moments of life. As we reflect on these medieval treats, it is important to recognize the long history that connects us to those who came before us. Our modern snacks may be far more refined, packaged neatly in colorful wrappers, and easily accessible at any convenience store. But they are in many ways the descendants of the very same foods that medieval people ate to survive and thrive. From the simplicity of the turnip pie to the rich indulgence of the honey cake, these medieval snacks laid the foundation for a global culinary tradition that continues to evolve today. So next time you indulge in your favorite treat, whether it's a piece of chocolate, a crisp apple, or a savory bite, take a moment to reflect on the long history of food that connects us all. Consider the humble origins of our snacks and how they have evolved over centuries. These small pleasures we enjoy today are a direct link to those who came before us, who found joy, comfort, and sustenance in their own simple meals. And in that reflection, we can all feel a little more connected to the past, to those who lived and ate before us, and to the shared human experience that transcends time and place. If you enjoyed learning about the medieval snacks and their fascinating history, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Share your thoughts or your favorite medieval snack with us. I'd love to hear how these ancient foods have inspired your own culinary journey. Until next time, may your next treat be both nourishing and full of history. Goodbye, and take care.